Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Well, first off, it's nice to meet you, Dr. DuPont, and we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this interview with us.
It is a privilege for me and a delight. I am honored and thrilled to be here with you today.
Thank you, sir. Okay, let's get started. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up?
I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and my father was a salesman and kind of unstable in terms of earning situation, so we moved a lot. So I was moving all the time, and I lived in Cleveland for a while, and then I lived on a farm in Ohio for a while, and then the family moved to Denver. And so I was in Denver for high school. And one of the things that happened to me there, a high school friend of mine was Madeleine Albright, which is kind of amazing to think about growing up in high school with her. But anyway, there, and then I went to college at Emory in Atlanta. And then I, going back all the way to high school, I had wanted to be a doctor. And so I went to medical school at Harvard Medical School in Boston. And if you can imagine this, at 32, I went out to get my first job. Before that, I mean, I had worked at things, but not a job like a career job. At 32, I went to get a job. And here I got this fancy Harvard degree in medicine and psychiatry and all those credentials, NIH, I had all the credentials in the world. What was I going to do? Well, one day a week, in my residency in psychiatry, I worked in the largest prison in the state of Massachusetts, the Norfolk Prison. It is the prison that Malcolm X went in as Detroit Red and came out as Malcolm X. Wow. That was the prison I worked at. And I fell in love with the prisoners. I really liked the prisoners. I was interested in them. Their stories just fascinated me. And so when I finished all my training, I say, okay, what do I want to do with my life? I say, I want to help those prisoners.
Marines landing at the mouth of the mountain. Fire was encountered during the initial landing. However, fire was being received. The Kilo Company had moved to heavy fighting by all units at one time or another throughout the area for the next 5 days. A major part of the 300.
I was a doctor in 1966, and that was the Vietnam War. And every doctor in the country had to do 2 years of military service. There were no exceptions. You didn't have to volunteer. You got your medical degree, you went into the service. So the question was where I was going to do my service. And the very best place to do the service that I could see was NIH.
A research laboratory for the Public Health Service called the Hygienic Laboratory was established in 1901. In 1930, Congress changed its name to the National Institute of Health.
And I like to say that getting into Harvard was easy compared to getting into NIH during the Vietnam War. But I did get into it. And so I came to Washington. I had no intention from coming from Boston to come to Washington, except to go to NIH. So I did 2 years at NIH, and that got me in Washington.
I call upon you to be with us when we go out Monday. Now about injunctions. We have an injunction and we're going into court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction.
If you can imagine this, in the spring of 1968, I was consulting with the parole officers in D.C. I think it was probably, I don't know, every couple of weeks. I would come into the city and meet with them. We met on Fridays. I don't remember the exact date, but Thursday night, in I guess April it was, Martin Luther King was killed.
We of Memphis are deeply saddened by the tragic event that has just occurred in our city, and we extend our deepest sympathies to Dr. King's family. Every conceivable effort is being made to apprehend his assassin. Meanwhile, we call upon all citizens of our community, as Dr. King would have wished, to maintain peace and order.
And that next morning, I was coming to meet with the parole officers in the city. So I drove into the city, and you know, there had been riots the night before. It was chaos in the city. It was a terrible situation. And Ken Hardy came into the meeting with the parole officers and me. And he said he wanted the white officers to go home and the black officers to go on the street and quiet the chaos. So I was right in the center of that, and drive through the city with fires and, you know, tanks. And now that brings up something I want to tell you. This is kind of emotional for me. When Martin Luther King died, a part of me died. I told you I lived in Atlanta, went to Emory there, and of course Martin Luther King Jr. was from Atlanta. In the middle of medical school, decided I wanted to take a trip to do something different, and so I bought a Land Rover, and I spent a year traveling through Africa. Now, that was an unusual thing to do. I went to 20 countries. I fell in love with Africa. And I carried with me a little letter that was written by Martin Luther King Jr., introducing me to this continent of Africa. Can you imagine that? It's my proudest possession from Martin Luther King. And I, on vacations, would work with SCLC, his group in Atlanta. So I knew him, I knew his wife, his kids. And people don't realize that at the church, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, he wasn't the person in charge. His father was.
Yes.
Daddy King. And he was a big man, and Martin was a small man. And it was amazing to watch those two interact. But anyhow, his death was extremely personal to me.
Reaching out through the vista of time, saying, if ye do it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye do it unto me. And ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. A great individual is a compassionate individual, concerned about the least of these. And really, in the final analysis, you've got to be concerned about the least of these because you are tied up with the least of these. Some strange reason. No matter how rich you are, you can never be totally rich as long as that is poverty in the world. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
But I don't feel negative about the decade. You know, it wasn't just negative things. It was a lot of impressive things and wonderful things, too.
This is a people's movement, old people, young people, poor people, all of whom live in the 3rd District. And it's not fair for these citizens who are gathered out here today to deliberately be left out of the picture.
So I don't have a negative feeling about the 60s. It was, the country, life has always been, I don't know what to say it, lots of troubles, lots of things to deal with. And that was true for the 60s too. But the assassinations were particularly striking at that period of time.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
that I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
of President of the United States.
People don't realize that at that time, D.C. was controlled by the federal government. The president appointed the mayor. Walter Washington was appointed the first mayor by Lyndon Johnson. And one of the big deals when Nixon came in was that what he was going to do with this mayor that had been appointed by Lyndon Johnson.
The mayor of the capital city, Walter Washington, is here tonight. He has served as mayor of this city with great distinction. There's been some speculation in the press to the effect that because he was a Democrat and his term expires in February, that he would not be reappointed to that position. However, in checking with both Democrats and Republicans in the District of Columbia, I find that he gets very high marks, and consequently today I have asked him to serve for another term. He's agreed to do so.
And the whole city's a sigh of relief because everybody loves Walter Washington. When Richard Nixon came in as president in January of '69, he had made a campaign issue about crime in D.C. He called it the crime capital of the country.
Washington's 3rd Police District. There is contrast here. From Embassy Row to devastated 14th Street, a corridor of violence in the spring riots of 1968. An average week in this district will bring 40 robberies, 16 aggravated assaults, and a high incidence of rape, homicide, and arson. With drug abuse the source of at least half the crime, 80 addicts this year will die from overdose.
He came into the office, and a group of prominent citizens in Washington went to him and said, unless you do something about the crime problem in Washington, we're going to have a press conference every week about your failures in that. So he got very interested in crime in Washington. Now, what did I do to get that job? What I did was went to the D.C. Department of Corrections, full-time, Harvard-trained psychiatrist, working in the D.C. Department of Corrections. And I had a man named Ken Hardy, who was a director at that time, and I feel very close to him, a wonderful man, very helpful guy. Well, in that context, I became interested in the fact of what drugs could have to do with the crime epidemic. And I took some urine bottles to the D.C. jail and collected urine from everybody who came in the month of August of 1969. And what I found was 44% of them were positive for heroin. And when I looked at the year they first used, it tracked exactly with the rise of the crime. In other words, they were using more and more as it went through the late 60s, and you saw the crime rate going right up with that. So then the question was, okay, Bob DuPont, what do you do about it? And I went around the country, looked at various options for treatment, and one of the ones that particularly attracted me was methadone treatment, which had started in New York City in 1964.
To help them change, rehabilitation programs have an enormous task. Some programs use regular oral doses of methadone, a synthetic narcotic, to eliminate the addict's craving for heroin. Though still addicted, They are more stable and can participate in their rehabilitation program without being preoccupied with getting heroin.
And when I came to work for the Department of Corrections, I didn't work at Lorton. Well, I did work at Lorton briefly, but mostly I worked in the city, and I worked in the parole aspect of it. In other words, people in the community. And I was very interested in how to get more community corrections and less institutional corrections, and also how to make corrections work better to help people get straight and have a good life, to stop the criminal behavior and change their way of doing things. So I started the Halfway House program in Washington as the director of community services for the Department of Corrections.
To be really successful, the program must provide long-term assistance to the former addicts who need to put together entire new lifestyles, develop job skills, find new friends, learn to cope with the stresses that they may have taken heroin to reduce.
I think people were very positive about the addiction treatment, and I never had a negative feeling about that. There was a feeling about methadone treatment early on that was pretty negative. People say you're just substituting one drug for another drug. It's not really getting people off the drugs, would be a criticism. And we had methadone overdose deaths that were worrisome too. And I had an experience I remember vividly. I was in my office. I had this kind of a small office, and nothing grand at all. And a reporter wanted to come. I had a lot of reporters talking to me at that time. I said, sure, I'll talk to you. And he came in at like 10 in the morning, and his name was George Allen, the same name as the football coach, but he wasn't the football coach. He was a reporter for Channel 9 television. And he came, how are you doing? You're doing fine. How's your program going? Oh, it's going fine. He looked at me in the eye and says, you're a liar. And I'm going to expose you. Your statistics are fraudulent. And this city's got to get rid of you. This is a reporter.
This was the reporter.
For WTOP television. And he said, you can listen to WTOP radio, which is like it is now. It has nonstop news. At noon today, and you will have your first story about your fraud.
Breaking news right now.
And I had to find if somebody who had a radio, and I listened, and that's what it said. And he went on with that and had a primetime television program just about what a bad guy I was and what a bad program this was. Now, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't have any idea anything like that would happen to me. Yeah. I didn't know what to do about that. But then we had two newspapers in town. We had the Star, which is the Evening Star, and the Washington Post. Both of those newspapers put people onto the story, and both of them came with major editorials supporting my program and saying the television program was wrong. And I'm happy to say that George Allen left town and I stayed. But it was a pretty striking experience for me.
In brief, what is heroin's origin and introduction to the United States?
Well, now there's a heck of a story. First of all, it all goes back to the poppy, the opium poppy that has a sap that has opium in it. And that was first started in Iran and that area in the Middle East. But that's where the opium problem comes from. The opiate problem comes from the poppy. So for thousands of years, people used opium for pain and all kinds of things in this. But in 1898, the Bayer Company in Germany was interested in a new kind of pain medicine, and what could they do? And so they jiggered with the opium, the morphine molecule, and they put on an extra acetyl group, a C and 3 H's, onto the morphine molecule. And this created a new product, and they called it heroin. Now, at the same time, they had another product that came from a plant, and that was aspirin. So they had two products. One was heroin and one was aspirin in 1898 in the Bayer Company. And they decided which was going to be the bigger one they put on the market. They thought it was going to be heroin. So they put on heroin on the market 1 year, and the next year was aspirin. Now, what was heroin used for when the Bayer Company did that? You know, it was for cough. It's a cough suppressant. And so they sold heroin, if you can imagine this, as a cough suppressant over the counter. No prescription needed for heroin. That's how it started. You can guess what happened next. We had a tremendous explosion of heroin problems, and it became a huge issue, leading in the United States to the Harrison Narcotics Act.
The Harrison Narcotics Act set out to control the source of narcotics in the United States. Although the Harrison Narcotics Act increased red tape, a person could get raw opiates and other drugs if he had the correct forms. Consequently, our friend who, before 1914, was able to buy his narcotics in the drugstore, now had to purchase them at the back of the pusher store, illegally. Because of the limited success of the Harrison Narcotic Act, the Narcotic Drug Import and Export Act was passed. This act limited the import of opiates into the United States to medical and scientific uses only. It also prohibited any import of morphine or heroin. The aim of the Narcotic Drug Import and Export Act was to limit the use of narcotics for legal purposes. This act covered a gap which the Harrison Narcotic Act had left.
Heroin is the kind of model for opiate addiction. And when I was at NTA in D.C., that was the concern, was heroin addiction. And where did the heroin come from in D.C.? Well, it didn't come from, the neighboring states. It came from poppy fields in Turkey. That's where it was. And they had these fields of poppies there to make opium as a medicinal thing. But a lot of it was diverted into illegal activities, and there it was made into heroin in Marseille, France. So I know it sounds odd, but it's Turkey and France, and it would come to New York, and then it would come down to D.C., and that's how we got heroin here.
All the little holes that are poked in there, that's heroin. Just falling loose.
And what was very interesting, when Nixon really picked up on the heroin problem, one of the things he wanted to do was to shut down that supply, and he talked Turkey into no longer raising poppies. This actually happened. And he got Marseille, which is where it was made into heroin, and got the French to shut it down too. And of course that had a positive effect on D.C. and everywhere. But what wasn't calculated was it's pretty easy to grow poppies elsewhere, and it's pretty easy to make it into heroin elsewhere. And so they diversified the supply, and it came back again.
I started to use it. I started to sniff it just to be part of a group. I started to use it while I was in school, and one day I woke up and I was addicted. I woke up and I was very sick, and I didn't know what was bringing it about. But I did find out that as soon as I took some heroin through my nose, I got well. I felt normal.
Concerning crime and addiction, give us a little bit more about the correlation of crime to addiction.
Yeah.
And what percentage of men and women entering the D.C. Department of Corrections were addicted?
Well, roughly half. And why was that? That was because they needed money. to do this. And one of the ways they get money was selling drugs, and another way was criminal behavior to get money for the drugs.
Sterling, this morning you were arrested for tampering with an auto. Do you understand the charges against you?
Yes, sir.
What were you doing this morning at that time?
Well, I was trying to get me some money so I could get me a fix, because I was kind of sick this morning and I didn't have my shot when I woke up.
How long have you been using drugs?
3 years.
What are you using?
I use heroin.
Also, the drug use changes a person. When a person is addicted, and they have, I think about it as a hijacked brain, and what that brain is hijacked to do is to prioritize the drug use and to minimize the negative consequences. So it's like the person has been hypnotized to think that I have to have that, those drugs, I have to have that. It takes over and it changes the people's behavior, and they become focused just on getting the drugs and doing whatever they need to get those drugs. So it both feeds on people who are impulsive, and it creates a behavior that includes crime and criminal behaviors like robbery and burglary and drug sales, but other things too. It's a corrupter of the soul, the addiction is. And that's why recovery is a beautiful thing. The person who has been addicted when in recovery, when they're not using it, go to AA meetings and NA meetings and things like that, they're a different person than they were when they were using.
Another lecture approach is to use ex-addicts. Gina, a former heroin addict, is able to involve the students in an atmosphere of free exchange by being totally candid about her past.
I was a prostitute for about 3 years, and I could not do it unless I was loaded. You understand? Like the periods, like if I cleaned up and I was on the natch, say, you know, and if I needed money, you know, nobody could give me enough money to do something like that. But when I was on heroin, like I told you before, it kind of insulates you so that you don't feel, you know, your true feelings. Things are kind of removed from you. So I'm just here to say, look at me. You know?
Well, describe for me, if you would, the neonatal abstinence syndrome.
Yes.
And what the short and long-term effects of that may be.
Yeah, well, it's complicated because, first of all, what it is withdrawal in the newborn baby. Okay. While the baby's in the mother's womb, it's exposed to the blood from the mother and the things that are in the blood, and that includes the heroin or the opiates in there. Okay. So when the baby is born, it loses that contact and it goes through withdrawal symptoms. That's what's happening here. And so for that to happen, the mother at the time of the delivery has to be using the drugs. If she stopped a week ago, there wouldn't be any neonatal abstinence syndrome.
Okay.
So she's got to be addicted and actively using for this to happen. But the problem is, in terms of the long-term effects, that there's a lot of other things going on also with that actively using mother, including difficulties with, you know, keeping up with prenatal care, nutrition, all kinds of things. So the babies tend to have lots of other things going on that are adverse because of the mother's lifestyle. So I started a treatment program called the Narcotics Treatment Administration, February 18th, 1970. And Walter Washington announced that. It was a big deal kind of thing. And that began my experience with the heroin problem in Washington.
We, the Lloyd and Youth Center Drama Company, has the pleasure of presenting to you the portrayal of one of the most deadly and influential enemies of our community, King Heroin.
Drug starts in the teenage years. And if you get through the teenage years, you get through to 21, the likelihood of starting the drugs goes way down. It's not zero, but it goes way down. The thing that was striking about the district was how many of the young people were using heroin. I mean, it was in some parts of the city, it was way more than that were using heroin. It was an epidemic that went on. It didn't stay that way, but it exploded, and it was devastating.
Want to buy some dope? I want some dope. Hey, Justin. Child, where my works at, man? Jack, the dope is beautiful. Man, where my works at, then, child? Them my works you got in your arm. Man, be easy, Jack. The dope is good. You weren't acting like that a minute ago. I was sick a minute ago, Jack. You gonna sell that kid that dope, man? And then the dope gonna make him slick. You don't want to go to school, don't want to work. Child, that kid in the 6th grade, child, look at his books, man. And you gonna get that kid that. Hey, Shawty. Hey, Jesse, give me some salt and water. Man, it fell out. What? Wait a minute, man. How many times you cut that dope? Man, the dope is good, man. Get shit down. Hey, man, do something, man. It's hard not beating. I say it's hard not beating. Do something. I don't know. It's hard not beating. Don't leave me by myself, please. Please don't leave me. I don't want no fella to be tired. I can't get in with it.
Once you got that idea that the heroin was the driver of the behavior, you could think about how to get the person off the heroin. And that became my window into drug treatment. We started this, one of the biggest programs. And to tell you that it was very interesting what that program was like. I was in the Department of Corrections for a year and a half, and I headed NTA for 3.5. So my entire district career was 5 years. That's not very long, but it was very intense. And that NTA experience for that 3.5 years, that was a model program for the whole world, not just in the United States. You don't have a lot of DC programs that people are coming from all over the world to see.
Most of you started smoking marijuana when you were introduced to narcotics.
I did. I started smoking weed. For me it was, but I wanted a different high, you know. And weed wasn't good enough, and I heard that heroin and stimulants, crystals, were a better high, and that's why I went to them, you know.
Yeah, I'm the same way, man. I guess a lot of people started that way. Speaking for myself, I did.
I started on weed and got burned out, and I needed something stronger, so I went to heroin.
Well, I started smoking weed, you know, because I was running away from something which was myself. And out of all I've run through a lot of highs trying to run away from myself: heroin, LSD, methadone. I like marijuana. I just couldn't handle it myself. I was looking for something else.
We were creating something that had never been before. Okay. There was no precedent for what we were doing. We had the authority of the federal government through the Nixon administration and under the wonderful Walter Washington for the city to just do what's the right thing to deal with this problem. And it was a thrill of my life putting together a staff of 500 people and 20 treatment centers in the city, 5,000 people at a time, total of 15,000 over the 3 years. It was exciting every day, what we were dealing with. The media was a big deal. Talking to the media was to reach a lot of people, dealing with the controversies. Every year, the big issue was the budget. How do you grow the budget? For example, getting grants from the federal government to help in the District of Columbia was a big project. It was fun. And most of the people were like I was then, very young and energetic and just excited by the mission.
The counselors know the patient, they know his daily routine, and they are wary of pitfalls.
You may have an argument with your wife. You might go to work in the morning, and all of a sudden, where you used to handle 25 cartons a day, the boss gives you 30 cartons. And this is another excuse. See, this is an excuse to go, well, I got to handle 30 cartons, so I'm going to go out and shoot dope, you know. You can be free from drugs for 5, 6, 7 months. And all of a sudden you want to reward yourself, you know, like, wow, I've been clean now for 6 months, you know. I'm doing great. You know, I'm making money, I got money in the bank, my wife loves me, my kids love me. Let me go out and get high, you know, and this happens. So these are the things you have to be aware of. But the point that I want to bring out is that if you do use, don't be afraid to come by, you know, and tell us, because that's what we're there for.
We had a fellow named Jim Fair who his only job was he had a little van that could carry 6 or 8 people, and he took people around from all over the world to see. We had 20 centers in the city, NTA centers, and to see what they were like and talk to the patients there and talk to them about their drug use and all, anonymously. That was amazing to see that. The senators that came, the journalists that came, the Congress people, I mean, it was all over. This program in Washington was a national model. So one of our most striking visitors was a freshman governor from the state of Georgia who came to visit. And that man's name was Jimmy Carter. He came to NTA. Now, how did Jimmy Carter get there? Well, it turns out that I had a person I worked with very well at the NTA days, who had gone to work for the Senate Intergovernmental Relations Committee, and he knew me, and he wanted to hold a hearing about drugs, and he said, I don't know who to have as a governor. I need a governor. I got a lot of other people here, but I don't have a governor. And I lived in Georgia, and that was my home, and we had this new governor, and Jimmy Carter, and I said, let's get Jimmy Carter. So I was the one who got Jimmy Carter invited to this hearing. And when he came up to the hearing, he came to visit NTA. Now, one of the things he wanted to know is how many of our 15,000 people were named Jimmy or James Carter, and were there 4 that had that name in his thing. And he related to our patients. I never saw anybody who could relate to the patients the way Jimmy Carter did. He was amazing kind of thing. And when he left, he said he'd like to have a program like this in Georgia. And I had a colleague of mine from Emory who was named Peter Bourne, and I suggested he would be good to head that program, and he did that. And Peter Bourne then became, when Jimmy Carter became president, he became Jimmy Carter's White House drug czar. But it was really just a thrill to have him come to NTA and look at it. As I say, a lot of people came. Well, that was a very special visit. Yeah. And his ability to relate to the patients was, I never saw anything like it. He was so approachable and so warm in dealing with people. It was amazing.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive.
Richard Nixon was very engaged in the crime problem and heroin addiction already. He'd started right off, as I told you how that started with that. But the explosive event in this history was the emergence of heroin addiction among service personnel, which was massive. And it threatened the entire U.S. military presence in Vietnam. It was explosive.
Like, I used to weigh about 165 pounds, and before I came in the program and everything, I weighed 130, 129. I was real thin. Like, all my clothes, all my pants I had, they were just baggy. I didn't look good. I was just skinny. Just lost a whole lot of weight, and people could tell. Just like you said, your face just be all dried up. You didn't even care how you looked, you just wanted some skag.
By June 17th of that year, Richard Nixon had a national press conference announcing the formation of a White House drug office. And what triggered it was exactly the problem in Vietnam.
This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had.
There's also a problem, speaking of the physical effects, of hepatitis and other things happening from using bad needles and not cleaning the vein before shooting up skag. Isn't this true? Are there other things that can happen to you?
Well, like recently I just saw a guy who was he was in the hospital and he was shooting dope right in here and right below his wrist. Another guy was hitting him and he hit an artery. I don't know what it did. It made it collapse, I believe he said. And like all his hand turned all purple and everything, and his fingers got the size of cigarettes. And they had to cut off his hand right from his knuckles all the way down to his thumb from shooting secanols, barbiturates right here in the wrist. It did something, his hand just went like that and just flew out. And they had to cut off all his fingers. Like, it's not too nice to see. It depresses you a little bit.
The thing that got Richard Nixon to want to go beyond just helping what we were doing in NTA, but to a national program, was that was the explosion that did it.
With regard to this offensive, it is necessary first to have a new organization, and the new organization will be within the White House. Dr. Jaffe, who will be one of the briefers here today, will be the man directly responsible. He will report directly to me. And he will have the responsibility to take all of the government agencies, 9, that deal with the problems of rehabilitation, in which his primary responsibilities will be research and education, and see that they work not at cross purposes, but work together in dealing with the problem.
And the first head of this White House office is named Jerry Jaffe. What he did, his brilliant step, was a new technology had just been developed to do drug testing using an immunoassay strategy. And Jerry Jaffe, the day after he's made White House drug czar, is on an airplane going to San Francisco to get these new equipment and carry it to Saigon. What happened then, if you were a service person and you were going to go back home, you had to be clean from heroin or drugs. And so you couldn't leave otherwise. And so he put that line in the sand. And that was a huge thing to turn things around in Vietnam. And it was a great example of a response to a problem, and it really made a difference. That was the trigger that got the government committed to this issue. Absolutely, it was not crime, it was not overdoses, it was Vietnam.
after getting married, sort of couldn't meet up with the responsibilities that I had taken on, and sort of felt the need to escape from these. My first marriage, I've been married twice, has only lasted about 4 years, with continuously using drugs.
You know, it's you don't have to be sick to get, or criminal or anything else, to get hooked on drugs. I mean, the drugs take over anybody who use them, and it changes people's priorities, and it's a very bad thing. But I like to say, you know, addiction is a teacher. An addiction teaches the addicted person. Addiction teaches the people around that person. It's a wonderful thing to watch a person, to know a person, and to come from being addicted to the drugs to being in recovery. It really is great. And the other thing is all the drugs are together. I had a group of ex-addict advisors at NTA, and wonderful people, probably 8 or 10. And I was really close to all of them. And I went to one of them, you may know his name, Nat Turner. Do you know that name? He was a musician here in Washington, and on the media a lot for a time. But anyway, he was one of them. And I went to his retirement party from a job. He was working in the government. And I asked him about the other guys. Now, these are former heroin addicts in D.C. And I had been very close to them, but I lost track of them. And we went down the names, all dead. I assumed they'd gone back to heroin. No, none of them had gone back to heroin. They'd all died of alcoholism. Every one of them died. These are former heroin addicts. They stopped the heroin, but the alcohol killed them. They went on because it, and I said, Knapp, how come you're alive and they're dead? And he said, because I went to AA meetings and they didn't. And that made a big impression on me. And it shows you that the drug addiction is not to a specific drug, it's to drug use in general. So that those former heroin addicts were very vulnerable to alcohol problems. Gotcha. And it took them all out.
How long have you had an alcohol problem? Ever since I come out of service. And how long ago was that? 1945, I believe. And how much have you been drinking each day during this past month? Drinking day and night. How much would you consume in a 24-hour period? No, 5 or 6 pints of that wine. How much Sterno did you drink? Me and Doug got to make 6 cans yesterday.
You know, if I would put a plug in for something that's meaningful to me and I think could be helpful to others too, is that I'm proud to be an American for lots and lots of reasons. But one of the big ones, the top ones for me, is that in 1935 in Akron, Ohio, 2 people got together and created what is now Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. AA is and Narcotics Anonymous too. They're all series of 12-step programs. There's a lot of them, but AA and NA are the main ones. Are a gift to the world, and they're a very American idea, American program, because it's people helping people. There are no professors there. There are no degrees there. You don't have to have a license to have an AA or NA meeting. It's just people who are in recovery, helping other people get into and stay in recovery. That is an American idea, if there ever was one.
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, Not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars.
Describe your steps, or the steps you took in your professional career that led you to become the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. What changes did you bring to that organization?
Well, first of all, it started the organization. As you say, the first one. There had been an earlier White House office, and it folded into what was NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I was the director for the first 5 years. Now there have been 5 directors of NIDA, and the current one, Nora Volkov, has been there for 17 years, so she's been a lot longer than my 5 years, that's for sure. It's become part of NIH, but it really was the center for the government of prevention and treatment. That's what we were. And we weren't part of NIH. We had a big program for various things we're doing, but we're particularly interested in training doctors in addiction medicine. So one of the great things we did was start a program to train more doctors to be experts in this. But it was a big change from D.C. to the federal government, and I guess I learned some humility about bureaucracies. The bureaucracies have a life of their own, and even the director is carried along by what the program is. There are 2, I would say. But anyhow, I'm very proud of NIDA. When I headed it, it had all the rehab kind of things as well as the research. Now NIDA has become just a research organization. So the organization has changed over those years. But I was very proud to go from the job as White House drug czar to the head of NIDA.
Mr. Vice President, are you prepared to take the oath of office as President of the United States?
I am, sir.
If you will raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Describe working as the White House drug chief. What was that experience like?
Well, it was the biggest thrill of it was the idea. The actual doing of it was, it's just a job, and you want to do some leading. You want to, give a good talk, meet with a governor, do the things you do to encourage the other people. And it's interesting that why there is a drug czar, because there isn't anything. It's the only issue in the country that has a White House office. There is no drug, there's no COVID office, there's no health office in the White House, there's none of that, only drugs. And there's been a White House drug office since 1971. Right. So it's a long time, and it's only drugs. And I think that's because the drug problem is so explosive. Yeah. I think that the idea that somehow it's going to go away or it's just one drug is not there. I think we got a very serious problem. The other thing, one of the biggest things that's happening with the drugs is to label alcohol and nicotine as drugs. They weren't drugs before. Drugs were the illegal stuff. But now every American knows that alcohol and nicotine are drugs with that name, and that's a big deal.
Now, what were the effects, say, of the heroin epidemic of the late 60s and 70s compared to those of other epidemics such as crack in the 80s and Oxycontin in the 2000s, excuse me?
Well, the way the drug problem has emerged in the United States, we have focused on one drug at a time. So we started with heroin. The next one was crack.
This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy, but it's turning our cities into battle zones, and it's murdering our children. Let there be no mistake. This stuff is poison.
The next one was methamphetamine. And then we had the prescription opiate problem, and now we have the fentanyl problem. Yeah. And it has never been a single drug problem. It's always been a polydrug problem. So it's as if the public attention just looks at one thing at a time. And so my line is, no, it isn't just one drug. It's all of those things all the time. And that's really been the case. You know, if you say, you know, what's your image today of an opiate addict, a fentanyl addict, you wouldn't think about D.C. particularly. You know, I think you'd think about West Virginia or Ohio or somewhere like that. You think about small towns and devastated by addiction.
It's actually somewhat out of control. We've never, and I've been here 40 plus years, experienced the level of daily drug overdoses in my entire career. It's a very sad thing for our community, and obviously sad for the families associated with the deaths.
But at the time that I was there, it was an urban phenomenon. And it wasn't just urban, it was inner city phenomenon. And lots of people were black who were using heroin at that time. So it looked different than it does now. And that's one of the changes that I've had in thinking about all those years that have taken place since then, is that I didn't think big enough. I didn't think broad enough. I was just thinking about D.C. I was just thinking about people in D.C. jail. I was thinking about what turned out to have been a very beginning part of a very big, not just national epidemic, but global epidemic. Because the idea when I was there that somebody on a farm in Ohio would be a heroin addict, I couldn't imagine that. But now that's become very common as the epidemic has spread.
The pace is really out of control for the staff. They're burned out, they're tired. When we can average almost 10 bodies per day in our facility, where historically 5 bodies a day was a busy day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, our staff is just plain tired.
Now, you're an accomplished author. What can the public learn from each of your books, and can you give us a brief description?
it's the evolution of my thinking is what you see in the books,
Okay.
And learning it as it goes. I don't know. The last book I wrote is called Chemical Slavery, and it talks about the slavery to the drug and how demeaning that is to the person and destructive it is to the person, and also to talk about what recovery is from that. And I've mentioned this several times in this interview about the importance of AA and NA in that process. So I guess that's it. And also the issue of the larger context. If you even bigger, leave aside drugs and think about a bigger context of that, you see the same kind of the problems going on with food, for example. And, natural foods are fairly easily dealt with, but manufactured foods are a different matter. And what happens with manufactured foods is that they are designed to stimulate the brain, and that's how our obesity comes. Our obesity comes from the manufactured foods because the reason they're manufactured that way is because people pay for them. I say McDonald's would sell you carrots if they could make money on it, but they can't make any money on carrots. But they make it on hamburgers, and that's true. And you see that same kind of dynamic of where the brain reward gets people in trouble with the commercial interest. The other one that's so fascinating to me is gambling right now. And gambling used to be an illegal activity. Now it's a big business. You watch the Super Bowl, and all you see there is ads for gambling. Where are we going with that? I think about sex for hire is sort of another place where you can go to legalize what was previously illegal. And the scary thing is that you add those things up, and it's an awful lot of temptations to a lot of people, and we're going to have a lot of people paid money to help them with those problems that we've created in our society. And I think the drugs are kind of like that.
Okay. Yes, sir. Concluding, the time that you spent working in D.C. resulted in many positive changes. We can see that. In what way would you like your legacy from that period to be remembered?
Well, I don't know. A guy from Toledo comes to Washington, D.C., and got some energy and wants to do some good and has the time of his life. That's the way I would say it.